the director of the Jean and Samuel Frankel Center for Judaic Studies here at the University of Michigan. This evening, we are delighted to join with the Copernicus Program in Polish Studies in hosting a talk by the creator of what is arguably one of the world's most exciting and innovative museum exhibitions. Our distinguished speaker is Barbara Kirshenblatt-Gimblett, who is chief curator of the core exhibition of the Polin Museum of the History of Polish Jews. The museum stands on land that was once part of the Warsaw Ghetto and has attracted over 1 million visitors since it opened in 2013. In contrast to the death camps and Holocaust memorials that have attracted visitors to Poland in recent years, this remarkable museum is a celebration of the vitality and vibrancy of Eastern European Jewish life before the Shoah. I recently visited the museum and was amazed at how Barbara and her team were able to distill 1,000 years of Jewish life in Poland into a tourist's afternoon schedule. The museum offers no omniscient narrator and instead invites visitors to explore artifacts and texts on their own and with their own interpretation. Without sacrificing any of the complexity of Jewish life in the region, the exhibition presents this remarkable history in a fascinating exhibition. Last year, the Copernicus Program in Polish Studies, along with the Frankel Center in Judaic Studies, established an official partnership with Polin. This agreement facilitates collaboration on research exchanges for faculty, as well as pedagogic activities for the University of Michigan students. This lecture is part of that partnership, and we look forward to continued collaboration with the Copernicus Program in Polish Studies and with the Polin Museum. Our lecturer, Barbara Kirshenblatt-Gimblett, is University Professor Emerita of Performance Studies at New York University. She currently serves on advisory boards for an array of organizations, including the YIVO Institute for Jewish Research, the Council of American Jewish Museums, the Vienna Jewish Museum, the Berlin Jewish Museum, and the Jewish Museum and Tolerance Center in Moscow. She's been honored with the Lifetime Achievement Award by the Foundation for Jewish Culture, the Mlotek Prize for Yiddish and Yiddish Culture, and the Marshall Sklair Award for her contributions to the social scientific study of Jewry. Most recently, she received a medal from the President of Poland for her contribution to the creation of Polin. Her published works include Destination Culture, Tourism, Museums, and Heritage, Image Before My Eyes, A Photographic History of Jewish Life in Poland, The Art of Being Jewish in Modern Times, and many other works of scholarship. One of my personal favorites, though, is her book They Called Me Meyer July, Painted Memories of a Jewish Childhood in Poland Before the Holocaust, which she co-authored with her father, Meyer Kirshenblatt. This book offers a history of interwar Poland unlike any others that have been told before. The book is illustrated with her father's paintings of his native Apt, the town in which he was born, and is narrated by his storytelling, which Barbara presents with verve and sophistication. The book brings to life a community that is no longer. When I first acquired that book as a review copy, I was sitting on my coffee table for a few days before, and my 4-year-old daughter would flip through it, and she absolutely loved it. She marveled at the painting of a boy carrying home a fish wrapped in newspaper, dripping with brine, and wanted me to read to her from it all the time. My parents also visited for a weekend and read the entire book from cover to cover in the time that they were there. I can think of few scholars whose work can garner that much attention from such diverse scholarship. It's this type of vitality, innovation, and erudition that she has brought to the Polin Museum, and which she will bring to us in her talk tonight. So please join me in welcoming Barbara Kirshenblatt.
Well, thank you very, very much, Jeff, for that wonderful introduction. I want to thank the Frankel Center and Jeff Weidlinger, who is the director of the Frankel Center, for this wonderful invitation, and Stacy Eckert, who really did everything possible to make the arrangements. But I also want to thank the Copernicus Center and Genevieve Zubczycki for all of her efforts as well. I think the collaboration, the partnership between University of Michigan, between the Copernicus Center, between the Frankel Center and Polin Museum is exactly what we need. And it is the way to build Polish Jewish studies in a very, very promising direction. So this is for me a wonderful opportunity to be here and to support this effort. So my first question is, how many of you have already visited Poland Museum? Okay, that's not bad. Well, the rest of you still have a chance. And how many have visited Poland in the last 5 years, let's say? Oh, many. Well, it's time for another visit, and it's time to visit Poland Museum. And I hope by the end of the evening, you will be convinced as well. It's not often that a museum makes history as well as chronicles it, and rare too when otherwise cautious observers remark at the opening of a new museum that it may prove a source of hope and pride that propels an entire society forward. Both of those things happened this week in Warsaw with the opening of Poland Museum. These are words that were written by Arnold Eisen, Chancellor of the Jewish Theological Seminary of America, just shortly after the grand opening of the museum on October 28, 2014. This is where we have created Poland Museum of the History of Polish Jews. We've created it, as Jeff alluded, on the site of the former Warsaw Ghetto, which was completely destroyed after the Germans suppressed the Warsaw Ghetto uprising. This is also the place that was home to the largest Jewish community in Europe and for a time in the world, the Jewish neighborhood of Muranów, the pre-war Jewish neighborhood. And that what this rubble communicates is that we really started from scratch. We started from the rubble. We started without any historic building. We started without a collection. But what we had was the story. And our commitment was to tell that story in a vivid, compelling, and memorable way. That was the starting point. The site, on the 5th anniversary of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising in 1948, this site was the site of the unveiling of the monument to the ghetto heroes. And you can see the rubble and a path that had been carved through it by 1945. In the background, you can see the ruins of the city of Warsaw, because a year later, after the Warsaw Uprising in 1944, the Germans destroyed 80% of the city of Warsaw. And so we feel that this is a very, very powerful way of communicating what it took to get from the rubble to this museum. And so the defining feature of the site on which the museum is built is the monument to the ghetto heroes, but it's in fact a monument not only to the ghetto heroes, but also to the great deportation of 300,000 Jews from the Warsaw Ghetto to Treblinka a year before. Now, in 1993, when the Holocaust Museum in Washington opened, a member of the Association of the Jewish Historical Institute of Poland attended the opening, was very inspired by it, and had the thought that if there was a Holocaust museum in Washington, there should be a museum of the history of Polish Jews in Warsaw. In a sense, the way I would put it is that the last thing that Poland needed was a Holocaust museum, in the sense that the country itself was already a massive Holocaust museum, in quotation marks. And what that means is Poland was where the Germans built all the death camps. The landscape of Poland is marked and will be marked forever with the signs of the genocide. But what was missing, what was lost, was not only 3 million Polish Jews, what was lost was also the world that they had created. And so to recover that world was, in a sense, was a moral obligation, so that that world and the memory of it would not also be forever lost with the loss of that Jewish community. And so already in the 1990s, the city of Warsaw had designated that orange area as the area of the future Jewish museum, if by some miracle such a museum would ever be built. Because keep in mind, 1993 is only 4 years after the fall of communism. It is astonishing that 4 years after the fall of communism, this idea would arise, and within a year or two, there would already be an allocation of the land which is facing the monument, and that by mid-90s, there was already a support committee, an international support committee, and the beginning of a project to create the museum. And that is, I think, quite astonishing. So the defining feature of the site and the defining relationship, if you will, is between the museum and the monument. And the way I think about it is that we go to the monument to honor those who died by remembering how they died. And until we opened this museum, first the building in 2013, and then with the core exhibition in 2014, this was really the place to go if you were in Poland specifically in some way to remember the Jewish community. But by creating this museum, we have completed the memorial complex. And what that means is that we can now go to the museum to honor those who died, to honor those who came before, those who came after, by remembering how they lived and how they lived for 1,000 years. And that story has been quite understandably overshadowed by the catastrophe, by the calamity, the all-defining event of the Holocaust. And so it's the relationship of the monument and the museum that completes the memorial complex. And I think that is really key to the power of the site. And here you can see very clearly that in terms of the chronology, the museum itself wasn't actually founded until 2005. And that was the year of the architectural competition, an international and the first successful international competition in Poland for a public building. And the winner was Rainer Machlamaki, a Finnish architect. And I like to think it took a Scandinavian architect to be modest enough to create a building that would be minimalist on the exterior, and as you'll see in a moment, dramatic on the interior, and to fulfill one of the requirements of the competition, which was that the building should stand in an appropriate and respectful relationship to the monument. And here you can see that it even echoes its geometry. But what's also astonishing about this building is that the whole exterior is clad in glass. And the entrance is an enormous glass window, and at the other side of the building is another enormous glass window. It's astonishing to create a glass building on a site of genocide. And to my way of thinking, the message of this glass building, which is filled with light, reflection, it's transparent, it's open, that's a huge message. And the big message is it's a kind of gesture of hope in the face of tragedy. And so the building itself, clad in glass, and the glass is like scales on a fish. It's not solid glass, but it's rather louvered, I would say. And on it is silk screened the word Pauline in both Hebrew letters and in Latin letters. And the museum itself takes its name from a legend that Jews told themselves about how they came to Poland and why they stayed. And it's within that legend that the word Pauline appears, and we have taken inspiration from that. And here you can see from the other side of the building, this is the largest glass window in all of Poland, and this window is suspended. It's actually hanging. It's not attached at the bottom. And so the glass, the light, the reflection, the transparency, the openness is an extraordinary statement. The drama of the building is on the inside. And I think that was a brilliant solution. And the inside is organic, warm, and even though it's grand, it's not overwhelming. It's actually a very, very comfortable building, and it's extremely responsive to light at any time of the day. Now, the entrance to the core exhibition is from the main hall down a flight of stairs, and it's the entire footprint of the building. The core exhibition occupies about 4,300 square meters. So it's really a large exhibition, and the candidates in the architectural competition actually received the master plan for the exhibition, which had been created before there was a building, so it was quite, if you will, flexible, and they were told, create a building to accommodate this exhibition, and they did. They created a big open space that was extremely flexible. Now, what kind of an exhibition do you create when you begin without a collection? Because the expectation is that a museum starts from a collection. And the great museums in the world have been forming their collections for a very, very long time, in some cases for centuries. And in this case, what we had was the story. And of course, we did form a collection for the purposes of the exhibition, but we chose a direction to create a multimedia narrative exhibition. Now, what I would like to emphasize is that there are two strands in the history of museums, two major strands in the history of museums. One starts from collections. It starts from art collections, cabinets of curiosity. It starts from disciplines that were collection-based, like the early history of anthropology, archaeology. That's one strand. And from that strand, we get the art museums that we have today. We get the anthropology, ethnography, natural history, geology museums that we have today. But there's another strand, and it is a strand that comes from the history of World's Fairs. It comes from a history of exhibition. And World's Fairs were laboratories of innovation for the creating of exhibitions. And it's from that history of exhibition that this museum takes its inspiration. And in the history of exhibition, there is no limit to the methods and the means that you can use. And so it's from that strand that we have begun, and we've created something that I think of as being more a theater of history than vitrines of objects, although objects will and do play an important role. And there are objects in the exhibition, but they are there in support of the historical narrative, rather than starting from a collection and building the story around them. Although the idea for the museum arose in 1993, it wasn't until 2005 that the museum was actually founded. So what did they do in the meantime? Well, the first thing I should say is that the founding of the museum was a public-private partnership that is the first, and it's unique in Poland. That's the first thing. But also, what was from my perspective very important when I agreed to lead the development of the core exhibition was that that the initiative didn't come from the state. That the initiative to create this museum came from a Jewish NGO, a Jewish nonprofit in Poland that had been created just after the war. It had been created initially to collect survivor testimony and documentation for war crimes trials and the like, and it evolved and it developed and became really the most important collection of material relating to the history of Polish Jews. So the idea that a Jewish NGO, the Association of the Jewish Historical Institute of Poland, was the initiator of the project, this is extremely important, especially, I think, in Europe, where most museums are initiated, developed, and funded by the state. So first, and I should add that this NGO had absolutely no experience in making an exhibition, making a museum, let alone raising a penny. So I like to think that it was only because they were so idealistic and so unrealistic that this museum could happen. Because truly, anybody realistic at any point in this process, up to, I would say, 2005, would have said, it's a pipe dream, it can't be done, it won't happen. And in fact, we had many naysayers as to whether this museum would ever in fact materialize. So first of all, the idea. 1996, the association says, okay, we're going to make it a project. And between 1996 and 2000 and going forward, the museum developed an outline, that is to say, the association developed an outline of the historical program, a database of material, and the master plan, which was the work of a British design company, Event Communications, in London. 2005, the agreement was signed, the architectural competition was held, the building opened in 2013, the grand opening with the core exhibition 2014, and by the end of 2015, we'd had 1 million visitors. And that is really astonishing. I think, the only other museum that could make any kind of claim for that number and much more would be Auschwitz, and actually the Museum of the Warsaw Rising, which is one of the most popular museums in all of Poland. And so in 2006, April 2006, we were ready to really take that master plan and to develop it as an exhibition. And so the first thing was for us to look at the master plan and to evaluate it and to decide what to keep and what to change. And I think just to give you a little bit of a sense of the kind of critical thinking and the kind of, I would say, critical historiographic approach that we took can be seen from the initial, if you will, I would say, schematic drawing that was the underlying concept of the master plan. So what was it? It was that there would be 3 lines. The first line would be something called the Polish and European historical timeline. The second would be something called, if you will, Jewish history. And the third would be transhistorical thematic galleries, women through time, weddings, Hasidism, whatever topic. And that was the first thing we rejected. We said that the history of Polish Jews is not a footnote to the history of Poland and the history of Europe, that we are not creating a contextual history where first we provide something called context and then we put Jews into the picture. We are creating rather an integral history. And when I show you our principles, I'll explain more what we mean by that. And furthermore, if you put all that cultural and social material into these trans-historical thematic galleries, what's left for that Jewish line? So as a result, we said, we are going to create one line, and it's going to be, we're going to integrate all of those elements to create an integrated and integral historical narrative. The second was that those red lines that are going across are what the designers called turning points. They thought that it would be very crisp and clear for the visitor if the division between every gallery was defined as a turning point. And our historians and our scholars said, but that's very schematic. The divisions, not every, the Khmelnytsky uprising, for example, the Cossack uprising in 1648, 1649, has often in the older literature been described as a, quote, turning point. But the newer literature says it's not a turning point. In fact, in the years that followed, the country recovered, Jewish communities rebounded, and there were, of course, new developments, but it wasn't a radical change. And so we rejected the idea of turning points. We said historical processes take many forms, and there are many developments, but turning points, schematically, is not the way to go. So I often said that we wanted to avoid a master narrative. And Moshe Rossman, who's a wonderful historian of the early modern period of Polish Jews, Jews in the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, and who worked very closely with us, he said, okay, so no master narrative, but there are what he called meta-historical principles. And these are some of them. They're not even all of them, but these are some of them. And they are, I would say this, we were fortunate as a team that the team of historians and scholars, because we also worked with sociologists, social psychologists, literary scholar, multidisciplinary, international, that our team, they weren't consultants. They were active members of a team that worked consistently and coherently on this project. And so when we ran out of money, the designers stopped, but we kept going. So as a result, we actually, in the long time that it took, we had the opportunity to really, really think through what we were doing. So here are the principles. The single most important period in the history of Polish Jews is 1,000 years. Now that might seem maybe obvious, maybe not obvious, but I cannot tell you how many times I was asked, what's the most important period in the history of Polish Jews? And usually the person asking already knows. For some, it's the post-war years. It's the period they lived through. It's the period they're living in. For some, it's the Holocaust. For many, it's the Holocaust. For some, it's the interwar years. Maybe that's the period of their grandparents or their parents. Nobody says the Middle Ages. And that's the first 550 years of the whole story. It's more than the millennium. It's more than half of the millennium. And so, but the key to this exhibition is the full 1,000 years, which has been completely lost and is, I would say, and the early periods are extremely interesting. People are surprised by what they discover in the early periods. The second is that Jews are an integral part of the history of Poland. They're not only in Poland, but they're also of Poland. And so this goes to the issue of this integral and integrated approach to the historical narration. Third, this is a story of coexistence and conflict, cooperation and competition, separation and integration. Now, what's underneath that? What's underneath that is an assumption that the dominant element in the history of Polish Jews is conflict and violence and anti-Semitism. And it was important for us to take the position that the history of Polish Jews is an expression of a spectrum of relations, that there are moments in this history where one side of that equation is stronger, where conflict is stronger than coexistence, where competition is stronger than cooperation, where integration is stronger than separation. And so that spectrum of relations was extremely important. I can remember we had a very fine Israeli historian working in Israel who came. We invited him to come, and he helped us to evaluate our presentation of the Second Polish Republic, which we organized in 4 thematic areas. He said one of those areas should be devoted to Polish anti-Semitism. Well, our approach is that violence, competition, anti-Semitism is an integral part of the story and should be woven all the way through and not treated in a separate gallery or in a whole separate, like a quarter of the interwar years gallery. So it's that spectrum of relations, which I think is critical to one of the other of our principles. That Polish Jews created a civilization that is categorically Jewish and distinctly Polish. And depending on the period, if we're looking at the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, it means that it's a co-territorial culture. So it means that it's, if you will, distinctly Jewish and distinctly also Ukrainian, Lithuanian, Belarusian. It depends on the area. But in principle, the idea here is that it's not either or. That Polish Jews became the largest Jewish community in the world and a center of the Jewish world. And that they lived continuously in this territory for 1,000 years, which you can't say about almost anywhere else in Europe. You can't say that about Spain, England, France, Germany, Austria, parts of Italy, Russia. So this is 1,000 years of continuous presence is a huge message. The power of telling the story in the very place where it happened. That might seem self-evident, but I can't tell you how many times I was asked, why are you making this museum in Poland? And so I said, well, do you ask that question about the Jewish Museum in Paris, the one in London, the one in Philadelphia? No. I said, where should we make it? They said, Tel Aviv or New York. Well, think about it. Would it have the impact in Tel Aviv or New York that it has where we've cited it on the site of the Warsaw Ghetto? And so we are, for that very reason, a site of conscience. And our task, and this goes very much to that spectrum of relations, that 1,000 years of continuing presence, it's that our task is to create a trusted zone, a zone of trust for engaging difficult subjects. That is, we have to trust our visitors, and our visitors have to trust us, and that if we succeed, we can open up a space that for informed and reasonable debate and dialogue around extremely painful and difficult issues, which, to the degree that they have entered into public debate, have been extremely polarized and polarizing. And so, hopefully, if we succeed, we may be able to contribute to that. So what I'd like to do now is to give you a sense of, from a curatorial and design and visitor experience point of view, how we do and how we, in essence, put those principles into action, and what does it mean to create a multimedia narrative exhibition where, particularly, I think it's really important because we do have visitors that come and are disappointed because they don't see a lot of original objects. So I like to make the case for the approach that we've taken. So first of all, the exhibition is organized in 7 historical galleries from the medieval period to the present. But there is a kind of a prologue, which is a poetic forest of time before time, that is a space of historical imagination, and it's here that we present the story the Jews told themselves about how they came to Poland and why they stayed. And this is the story, and we use the version that is very beautifully told by Agnon, the Nobel Prize winner for Hebrew literature. And the story goes something like this. Jews were fleeing persecution in Western Europe. They came east, they found themselves in a forest, and then the variations on the legend go something like this, because there are variations. Peretz has a version of it in Yiddish, and Bader has a version of it in Yiddish, and there's some other versions as well. So the various versions go something like this, that the clouds broke, and an angel's hand pointed, and the Jews in the forest heard the word Pauline. Or the birds were chirping, Pauline. Or they saw pages of the Gemara floating down, or they saw Hebrew words carved on the trees. And when they heard the word Pauline, they thought they heard Hebrew, Pauline, rest here, or here you shall rest. And they said, that's how we know that this is the place that we should stop, this is the place we should stay, and we should stay here until we're taken to the land of Israel, which means until the Messiah comes, which is a very long time. Now, for the medieval gallery, we started in 965. 965. And you may ask, why 965? Is that a significant date in the history of Poland? No. Why 965? We start in 965 and we take it all the way to 1507. You may well ask, why 1507? And that means that this gallery, the medieval gallery, occupies, as I indicated, more than half of the millennium story, more than half of the 1,000 years. Now, for this more than 500 years, there are only two kinds of objects that are specifically Polish and Jewish. Two. What are they? Coins, they're about the size of a dime, that have Hebrew letters on them, and tombstones. The earliest tombstone was 1203, and the coins also date from the late 12th, early 13th century. Now, can you imagine creating a story of 550 years with coins and tombstones? So, if we're committed to the story, we have to do something else. So first of all, why 965? 965 because we have a travel account, a very famous travel account by Ibrahim ibn Yaqub, a Jew from Cordoba sent by the Caliph on a diplomatic mission across Europe. And in this travel account, he basically describes the various places that he went. And if a kid in high school who's studying Polish history knows anything Jewish at all, it'll be about Ibrahim ibn Yaqub and the Holocaust. Now, why Ibrahim? Because it is the earliest extant document containing a mention of Poland, of the land of Mieszko. So from our point of view, it's a place where our Jewish story and our Polish story meet. And because it's in Arabic, we actually present a quotation from him, and we present it in Arabic. It's one of the first texts that a visitor encounters, and it's in Arabic. The very first texts are actually in Hebrew. Now, what's critical here is that our approach is to be authoritative without being authoritarian, which is to say that we want to tell this story basically in the first person through primary documents and only through sources from the period. And I like to think of these sources as what I would call intangible heritage. Intangible heritage. That is to say, these are, if you will, not just simply physical texts, but these are words, ideas, thoughts, emotions, descriptions. From our point of view, they are a kind of artifact, but they are intangible. And that means that our rabbinical responses, our travel accounts, chronicles, these are for us critically important materials. And when we quote from them in the original language and in a font or a typeface from the period, whether it's Arabic or whether it's Latin font, Hebrew font, and then we have Polish and English translations. Now, it's a big story, and a key to the telling of the story is to create what we call a hierarchy of communication. And what that means is that we need to determine what is the main message, and then for visitors who are interested, they can go to the next layer. Now, in the field, museum professionals, at least some of them, distinguish between skimmers, swimmers, and divers. And what they say is that your layer one, your top layer, because the whole approach is called layering. The top layer is for the skimmers, and the second layer is for the swimmers, and the third layer, which is often in the form of an interactive presentation with a lot more content, a lot more material, takes more time, that's for the divers. And so hopefully, if our visitors will learn and accept our rules of engagement, they would be able to move quickly through the whole exhibition at layer one. Others might take longer and dip down into layer two where something's of interest. And those who are deeply interested in a subject, might get lost in layer three. Depends on the people. Okay, so the first gallery then ends in 1507. Why 1507? Because we have a fantastic document which is called the Coronation Tax Document of 1507. And what happened that by the time of the coronation, first of all, when there was a coronation, there was a tax because somebody had to pay for the party. And so they would simply do a coronation tax. And by 1507, there were enough Jews living in enough places in Poland to pay the tax. So in the coronation tax document, there's a page dedicated to the amount paid by Jews in various places in Poland, in Poznan, in Krakow, in Warsaw. And we can tell from the amount of tax which were the largest Jewish communities, and we can begin to calculate how many Jews were living in Poland by 1507. So that becomes a kind of a useful moment to move from the medieval gallery to the period of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, which is the 16th, 17th, and 18th centuries. And this is often called, quote, a golden age in the history of Poland, and also a, quote, golden age in the history of Polish Jews, although we think of golden age as a kind of cliche or a trope, and we don't actually use it ourselves, but certainly visitors will recognize it as the period when this country was at its largest, and also when the Jewish community really expanded exponentially. So if we had between, let's say, 10 and 15,000 Jews living in Poland in 1507, and I would say it's a much smaller territory, by 1765, there was a poll tax census for the whole territory of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, which includes what is today Poland, Ukraine, Lithuania, Belarus, and other adjoining areas. By 1765, according to that poll tax census, Jews were not living in 100 places, more or less, which was at the end of the medieval period, with Jewish communities in about half of them. They were now living in over 1,100 places, and the population was estimated at 750,000 Jews. And that was not primarily because of migration. It was primarily because of a natural increase, and also because we're dealing with a much larger territory. And so it's here that we really want to communicate, and we do it largely through Krakow, but not only. We want to communicate what was, quote, golden from a Jewish perspective about this period. And the two critical elements, apart from, I would say, the demographic expansion and the economic aspect, the two critical elements were the rise of rabbinical authority, learning, printing, yeshivas on the one hand, and a very high degree of communal autonomy on the other. And that's what we try to present here. But in order to understand how this happened, it was critically important for us to communicate that Jews were one of many religious denominations in the Commonwealth, that this was an incredibly diverse place, many religions, languages, cultures, that Jews were one of many, and it wasn't simply a question of Poles and Jews, it was Jews, Karaites, Protestants of every variety, Catholics, Tatars, Muslims, that it was very diverse, and that unlike the religious wars that were tearing apart Western Europe, and this period, although there was obviously conflict, there was also blood libel, host desecration, all kinds of conflicts, overall, for the early modern period, religious toleration was an extremely important element in trying to understand the place of Jews in this wider picture. Now, how do you bring to life the story of rabbinical authority, scholarship, yeshivas, and the story of printing? And so one of the things that we did was to create printing presses. We intended it for kids, but it turns out adults love it. And you have the opportunity to print Jewish printers' marks from the 16th century, the title page of the Shulchan Aruch, the Code of Jewish Law, with the notes of the great Rabbi Moses Isserles. And it's very physical. It turns out that some of these physical things are actually more compelling and engage visitors more than the fanciest digital interactive. Who would have known? And so but at the same time, we created a library that was inspired by the dream library of David Darshan, a preacher and a student of Rabbi Moses Isserles, who went to Italy and formed a collection of books, brought them back, and he was a preacher, and he wrote a text about his dream library and who it was for. He said, for people who have money but no time, people who have time but have no money, people who, and they don't have to go to a rabbi, they can come to him, he'll look it up in a book. And so, inspired by his dream library, we created our own library, so to speak, with these stenders, using these very traditional stands. And we were able to open the books digitally and to interpret them so that visitors who don't have a clue about the Shari Dura, which is a handbook for experts on kashrut, especially on like the salting of meat and all kinds of other issues, so as to make these texts meaningful and interesting to visitors who know nothing. And one of the most marvelous texts that we were able to show in this way is a Kabbalistic scroll that was copied by our David Darshan in Modena as part of his, I would say, spiritual development, which was to take one of these Kabbalistic scrolls and copy it top to bottom. And this has never been shown publicly. And what we've done is to use it to introduce the Jewish mystical tradition and to introduce the Kabbalah to our visitors. And the beauty of this is that you can make it bigger, you can look at it in detail, and there's interpretation provided as well. And so we close the first half of the Commonwealth period, so that would be 1569 to 1648. We close it with a story of Jews in the economic life of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. And we use a principle of pars pro toto. Rather than make an amalgam, we take Krakow as our big site in the presentation of civilization. We take Zamość and the huge estates of the nobleman Jan Zamoyski as the centerpiece for presenting the economic story. And then we have what Adam Teller, who was the historian responsible for the Commonwealth period, we have what he called the Corridor of Fire, where we present the Khmelnytsky uprising, the Cossack uprising, and the pogroms that accompanied it. And in this case, we narrate it almost entirely through the voice of Nathan Hanover, who was an eyewitness to the massacre in his own town, but also who heard from others about what happened. And he printed his account within just a few years after 1648. And in this case, we can't let his account stand by itself because the numbers that he gives are exaggerated in comparison with what historians know today. And so we have other ways of incorporating our modern historical insights. After the Khmelnytsky uprising, the Commonwealth recovered, Jewish communities renewed themselves, and what we do is a zoom in on what we call the Jewish town, miasteczko in Polish. And we put a taboo, a ban, on the S word. So, and you can imagine well, there are many things you could imagine, but the S word is the word we introduce first of all, if we speak Yiddish, we can speak about the shtetl. And if we speak about the shtetl, it's in relation to Stadt, Dorf, Yishuv. It's in relation to a whole spectrum of places where Jews lived. But if we use the word in English, then the first association is Fiddler on the Roof, Sholem Aleichem, Mendele, Peretz, and etc. And what we wanted to do was to distance our visitors from the image they have that all of East European Jewish life, and particularly all of Jewish life within the historical territory of Poland, was essentially basically something called shtetl. So what we've done is to displace the so-called Jewish, what we call the Jewish town, from the 19th century, and when we come back to it in the 20th century, it doesn't look anything like Fiddler on the Roof. So here, in the period 1648 to 1772, which is the second half of the Commonwealth period, when we zoom in, what we're interested in, when we say the Jewish town, what we mean are those places where Jews settled in large numbers, where they formed a substantial percentage of the population, created a distinctive way of life in these places, and gave those towns a particular character. And we're interested in how and why that kind of settlement formed, which is so very specific to this territory. And so it's here that we try to present everyday life, and we organize it around the marketplace. We include women's lives and women's spiritual lives. We have wonderful ways of presenting women's supplicatory prayers, of trinas, and books that were actually created, essentially ethical books of conduct for women in Yiddish. And we're probably the only museum of Jewish history that has a church. Now, I have to tell you that I've had Israeli visitors come and they didn't realize it was a church. I said, how can they not know it's a church? It's obvious. So a colleague of mine said, well, there's no cross. And I said, well, I don't think we can go that far. So, because, you know, it's not like literally a church. What it is it's a principle that we use in making the exhibition, which is that we have a phenomenon that we want to communicate. In this case, it's the changing relationship of the church to the Jews. That's the phenomenon. And then we think to ourselves, what would be an evocative setting within which to present that phenomenon? We decided we be the church. And then we say to ourselves, and we do this all the way through the exhibition, how might the church as a setting be a platform for communicating this changing relationship? So, for example, on the wall that would normally have been the altar, we present a film that we made about the story of Jacob Frank. Now, there was an argument. Does Jacob Frank belong in the synagogue or in the church? And I said, Jacob Frank, not in my synagogue. Why the church? Because the followers of Frank wanted to organize and did organize 2 big disputations with the rabbis, what they called themselves the contra-Talmudists, they called the rabbis the Talmudists, and they organized 2 disputations. One was in the Lvov Cathedral and one was in the cathedral in Kamenets-Podolsk. So I figured if they organized those disputations in cathedrals, Frank belongs in the church, and that's where he ended up. But we've really used, if you will, church furniture, church elements, as it's almost like Toy Story. It's like the furniture itself can be converted, it can become a platform for the content that we want to present. So that's the first center of gravity in our Jewish town is the marketplace and the home, the tavern, the church around it. And the second center of gravity is the synagogue, which of course was a center of Jewish life. And what we've done here, because this is really a principle that I would call narrative space, it's about how you organize the story in space. That's what an exhibition is. It's a story in space. And what defines it is the movement of the visitor. It's only as the visitor moves that the story unfolds. And so that's really very specific. That's the difference between, if you will, theater, where you sit like that and people up here move, or film. Here, this stays put and you move. And that is a defining, from my point of view, that is a defining feature of exhibition and of the visitor experience. And so we had a very marvelous opportunity. In 2007, I was introduced to Rick and Laura Brown of Hans House Studio. And Hans House Studio in Massachusetts has this incredible motto. They are a nonprofit educational organization. They are sculptors, makers, doers. They teach at the Massachusetts College of Art. And their motto is to recover lost objects. To recover lost objects. They were recovering an 18th century submarine, a crane from the Renaissance period. When they discovered wooden synagogues, they discovered their ultimate lost object. And so they said that they had already, if you will, recovered the bima, the reader's platform that you can see in the middle of this image, that they had already done that for a synagogue, for a wooden synagogue that once stood in Gvozdets, which is today in Ukraine. And that they did it in a way that, first of all, they used traditional tools, materials, and techniques. So here is and in the process we created a new kind of object. Now, why do they use traditional materials, tools, and techniques? Because they said, you can never recover the original object in the sense of the original material, but you can recover the knowledge of how to build it by building it, and building it in this way. So what that means is that the value of this object is in the intangible heritage that was recovered, and that the recovery of that intangible heritage was a way of materializing history. So the outcome was the object, but the value was in the recovery of this knowledge, and that is absolutely exceptional. So these synagogues, there were once 150, 200 of them that we know of across the length and breadth of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. And then when during the Holocaust, during the war, basically all of them were destroyed. There's not one of these synagogues were constructed in basically in the 17th and 18th centuries, the great ones, the big ones. Then there were some that were built in the 19th century, but they tended to be more modest. They weren't really the great ones. But there's not one of the great ones left. And so the idea of, and of course, I actually wanted the whole synagogue 100% scale. Director said it was too much. So I settled for the painted ceiling and the timber-framed roof. So the timber-framed roof, you can see here, and we created this at Open Air Museum in Sanok in the south of Poland. And after we had completely constructed it in 6 weeks, we had altogether for the project 300 volunteers and experts working with us. It's put together with wooden pegs, like a wooden puzzle. Took out the pegs, numbered all the parts, brought them to Warsaw, and I'll show you what we did in just a moment. Now, it just so happens that this synagogue that once stood in Gwoździec was, we think it was built around 1640, more or less. We're not exactly sure of the date. And it was destroyed during World War I when the Russian front moved through Gwoździec. But miraculously, it's also the best documented of any wooden synagogue. So this photograph and these architectural drawings, well, the documentation started in the 1890s. And actually in 1890, there was a Polish artist and historian that began the documentation, but the great documentation was done by Alois Breyer between 1910 and 1913. And so it was on the basis of that documentation, including color studies, that we were able to do to in a sense, if you will, I like to use the word recover rather than replicate or copy or reconstruct any of those rewords. And we then assembled all of this in Warsaw, and we hoisted it and we suspended it on cables. It's 25 tons. And the engineers tell me we're safe under this structure. Now, the painted ceiling, which is another whole story, was created in 8 segments. We made 8 segments, and we formed 2-week workshops in masonry synagogues in different cities in Poland: Gdańsk, Sejna, Kazimierz Dolny, Warsaw, Kazimierz Krakow, Szczebrzeszyn, Rzeszów, all across the country, south, north, east, west. And in 2 weeks, these teams actually painted these panels with expert guidance using traditional pigments and techniques. And in fact, there's a student, I think, there's one of the students at the University of Michigan that took part in the painting of the ceiling, and I met her today, and I was thrilled that she had that opportunity. And so I think of this as a new kind of object, as it's actual. It's not a copy, it's a new kind of object, and that for me is critical in appreciating what it is. And it's really absolutely breathtaking to be there. 1772, this great big huge commonwealth had become very decentralized. The nobles were really running the place, and the army was weak, and Prussia, Russia, and Austria looked at the commonwealth and said, let's each take a piece of the royal cake. And so the commonwealth was partitioned between 1772 and 1795. And from then until World War I, Jews were now living in the Kingdom of Prussia and then eventually Germany and in these empires. And so this long 19th century, for us, if you will, the main theme is what we call encounters with modernity. And this is a theme that we explore also in everyday life through transformations of the wedding from the end of the 18th century until the beginning of the 20th century. And we do this using autobiographies and memoirs, because it's in this period, it's in the 19th century, where Jews experience such radical changes in their own lives that we get a whole spate for the first time of memoirs and autobiographies, unprecedented. I mean, we have very little from the earlier period. We have, from the 18th century, we have a wonderful, I wouldn't even call it a memoir or an autobiography, from Ber Bolochov, a wine merchant. And mainly it's his commercial exploits, exporting vodka and importing a Hungarian Tokaj to Poland. But from the 19th century, we have incredible materials. So we use those memoirs not only to document change, but also to communicate the consciousness and the experience of change. And the Jewish wedding here, we use the memoir of Paulina Vengerov as a great one. So there are, on the one hand, there's everyday life and how dresses, their dress reform in terms of marriage age, education, language, but then there are also organized responses. Obviously the Jewish Enlightenment, the modern yeshiva, and Hasidism, the expansion and growth of Hasidism. But I should say that around the synagogue in the earlier gallery are, if you will, the emergence of new religious leaders and spiritual movements, from the heretic Jacob Frank to, if you will, heterodoxy. So the Vilna Gaon, the Baal Shem Tov, and Mendel Levin, who represents the Jewish Enlightenment. But those are just, if you will, the beginnings. The expansion, the development is for us a 19th century story. Now, when my historian said, you have to present the modern yeshiva, I said, doesn't sound like we're going to be able to captivate the 15-year-old Polish boy, which is our hardship case. So I said, where's the material? And they said, well, there is none. They said there's no photographs, no paintings of the modern yeshiva, the Volozhin. There's a photograph from the turn of the 20th century of the modern building, but there's nothing. There's no drawings, there's nothing. And we're talking about the early part of the 19th century. So we were fortunate enough to commission research by a student of David Asaf, who was writing a dissertation on the history of the modern yeshiva, and he brought to us excerpts from memoirs and autobiographies of yeshiva students and of people who had visited the yeshiva. And when we read this material, which was so vivid and so enthusiastic and so clear, we decided to make a film. And what we did, essentially, is we created the scenography in the studio, in the computer. But then what we did is we cast live actors and we painted them. And we filmed them against a green screen. And we then put together the settings that we'd created in the studio with the live painted actors. And when we had the film made, what we then did was to project the film on canvas and refilm it so that you could see the texture of the canvas, because the inspiration for the film was a 19th century painting. So it's 24 hours in the yeshiva of Volozhin in 4 minutes and 45 seconds. And considering that we started with nothing, well, it seemed like nothing, that what we started was intangible, we were able to make one of the most compelling and interesting presentations of a very important subject. We come to the middle of the 19th century, and the pace of change changes, and we shift gears, and we move to the economic story, the story of industrialization, urbanization, demographic expansion, and we come up into the last decades of the 19th century, and we look at integrationism, we look at the rise of modern forms of anti-Semitism, obviously the waves of pogroms of 1880-81, and we end with a section we call auto-emancipation. We take the term from Pinsker's essay and we treat it as, if you will, Jews taking things into their own hands. Emigration on the one hand, the emergence of modern Jewish political movements and social movements, and the emergence of modern Hebrew and Yiddish literature. And for us, a central figure in this story, of course, is Yudlamet Peretz, but it's also Hebrew and also Yiddish. World War I, the empires collapse, the Second Polish Republic forms, and we have created the scenography for the interwar years, for the 1920s and 30s. It's a scenography of an interwar years street, and it is a composite of streets throughout the large cities of Poland. So that means, obviously, Warsaw, but there are other streets, Lublin, for example, and it's a double height gallery. Because we were given this extraordinary space, there are some areas that are very, 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 very high. And so what we've done, and this is really critically important to our whole approach to narration, is we try to keep our visitors in the historical present. We ask our visitors, please do not foreshadow what will happen. Please do not backshadow through the lens of the Holocaust. Stay in the historical present. And we narrate in the historical present using only documents from the historical present as much as possible in, quote, the first person. And here it becomes extremely important. If you look down to the end of the street, and I should say that the street is organized, and I'll show you in a moment, in several sections. If you look down to the end of the street, you do not see the Holocaust. And we try, in the presentation of the 1920s, to not take the position of Celia Heller, who titled her book On the Edge of Destruction, but rather to try to communicate how Jews in the period understood their situation, and especially a period that some historians have described as a second golden age, despite economic hardship and rising anti-Semitism, because of the political energy and the cultural creativity. And so we've divided the interwar year gallery into 4 thematic areas. One is politics, and here we focus on the 3 main parties, obviously the Zionists, the Aguda, the religious party, and the Bund, the Jewish labor movement. We create an historical timeline in the politics gallery that captures key moments that were important in this period to Jews and how they responded. We begin with Jews in the Polish parliament with an interactive presentation because Jews were elected to the Polish parliament, and we end with Jews and communism. So those are the kind of bookends to the timeline. The second big area is culture, which begins with Yiddish, with Vilna, and with Yiddish literature, press, performance, and it gradually shifts to an emphasis on Jewish creativity in the Polish language, which was really very important in this period, particularly younger generation that was moving more and more towards Polish, as well as Jews who were very active in the creating of modern Polish literature. This is probably the largest manual interactive I've ever seen in a museum, because you can lift these newspapers up and explore them. On the upper level, we devote one area to growing up, because there was a huge investment in Jewish youth. We use the YIVO autobiographies. These are 3 contests, and hundreds of autobiographies by Jewish youth were submitted to these contests between 1930 and 39, and we use them to narrate the experience of growing up in the interwar years, the creating of if you will, an interwar year generation, which would have been my father's and mother's generation, and then finally everyday life across the length and breadth of Poland. And here we take inspiration from Landkentenisch, which would be, in a sense, the sort of touring societies, local history, krajoznawstwo in Polish, and it's our way of, if you will, communicating how important an appreciation of local history and landmarks and nature were to the creating of a unified Second Polish Republic, which was composed out of 3 parts that had been in the partitions for more than 120 years. So it's, I think, a very, very interesting approach. And now we come to the end of the interwar year gallery, and what visitors see before they turn the corner is they see people looking up. And the question is, what are they looking up at? And when you turn the corner, you see that they're looking up at bombs falling on Warsaw. And who's in this photograph? It's the American ambassador and his staff standing outside the American embassy, getting ready to evacuate a few days after the Germans have invaded Poland. And the Holocaust gallery, that lead up to it, this is all the way through the exhibition. It has been our mission that this story not be teleological, that it not drive inexorably to the catastrophe, to the genocide. That is critically important to this narration. So the setting of the Holocaust within this 1,000-year story is a very, how can I say, I think what it does is it sets the Holocaust in a way that is never done, basically, truly never done in Holocaust museums. Holocaust museums set the Holocaust within a history of anti-Semitism. We set it within a history of Polish Jews. And it raises some very, I think, interesting and pressing questions. So the first and very, very important principle we used in the Holocaust Gallery was that our story begins with the invasion of Poland on September 1st, 1939, because everything that happened before September 1st, 1939 happened in the 1920s and 30s. And that's where our visitors can discover rise of Hitler, the Anschluss, all those events happening in Europe, Kristallnacht, all the events happening in Europe are for us an interwar year story. It's also linked to the rise of virulent anti-Semitism, particularly after 1935 in Poland. So first of all, it starts in 1939, September 1st. Second of all, the territory is the territory of occupied Poland, consistent with the kind of geography that we use. Thirdly, it's the principle of narrating in the first person. And we're able to do that because we have absolutely extraordinary material. So the Warsaw Ghetto is one part of the Holocaust Gallery. It's understandable that we are on the site of the Warsaw Ghetto, and that if we're going to present the ghetto, then we would do pars pro toto, part for the whole, and that we would take the Warsaw Ghetto both because we're on the site of the Warsaw Ghetto and because of the material that we have. And our narrators are Adam Chernyakov, head of the Judenrat, the Jewish Council, and Emanuel Ringelblum, who was head of the Secret Archive, that actually collected and recorded and documented everything that was going on in the Warsaw Ghetto and beyond, because refugees came and other information came from well beyond the Warsaw Ghetto. And it's quotations from their diaries that accompany the visitor all the way through. It's kind of point counterpoint. You hear what the official head of the Jewish Council that was established by the Germans to run the ghetto and to carry out their orders, what he said in his diary, and what Emanuel Ringelblum, who was a labor Zionist and historian, what he said in his diary, and that point counterpoint. Now we are able to to present the Holocaust in its moment from the perspective of those in the story who didn't know what would come next. And we are able to do that because of the Ringelblum archive, which was, at the time of the Great Deportation, the team realized they may not survive, unlikely they would survive, and they packed the archive up into tin boxes and into milk cans. And immediately after the war, those who survived and knew the 3 locations, we now think it's actually probably 2, but the 3 locations where the material had been buried, they then dug it up, and that material now is a UNESCO World Treasure, and it's housed at the Jewish Historical Institute in Warsaw. And we're able to work with that material, and what that means is that we hold strictly to this idea of being in the moment and not looking forward. In the case of the Holocaust Gallery, what's critically important is that those in the story didn't know what was going to happen next. And it's only gradually that they learned what would happen next, and we gradually lift the veil as, if you will, the picture becomes more clear to them as well. And so that means that this is an unusual gallery because there's no post-war material. There's no post-war survivor testimony. There's no video of survivors recollecting 30, 50, 60, 70, 80 years ago of what happened. And for that, we have a resource center, access to the Spielberg, to the Shoah archive, and we have all that material available to our visitors, but not in this gallery. And so the Holocaust Gallery also includes life, if you will, on the Aryan side, that is to say the area outside of the ghetto, and Polish-Jewish relations during the Holocaust. And then we come out, we end obviously with the death camps, and we bring our visitors out to a presentation of what the world knew, attempts to get the word out, and the, if you will, the liberation of Jews from concentration camps, repatriation from the Soviet Union, and those who were in hiding, those few who survived in hiding. When we come to the post-war gallery, we begin with the rubble. We begin with the ruins. And essentially, the big question in the post-war gallery was whether to stay or to leave. And we've organized this story in space. On the one side is the story of leaving, on the other side is the story of staying. And the story of leaving is a story essentially of more and more and more Jews leaving. Between 1945 and 48, over half of the Jews living that were in Poland at the time left. And that is to say, if there were 240 Jewish survivors in Poland in that period, about 150,000 left. And there were various reasons for their leaving, but among those reasons was post-war violence of the most unimaginable sort. So on that side that deals with leaving, we specifically present the pogroms and other forms of violence in the period, particularly 1946-47. And of course, the iconic case is the case of the Kielce pogrom, the pogrom in Kielce. And our approach to this, I think, is very typical of our approach more generally. That is to say, we start the story with these young, healthy Zionists who are getting ready to go to Palestine. Some have already left. They're living in a kibbutz on 7 Planty Street in Kielce, which was also the headquarters of the Jewish community that was renewing itself. And those 2 doors are, if you will, the starting point for what happens essentially outside them. And I mean, obviously within the apartment, but mainly outside. When you turn to the other side of those doors, you get what happened, the bare facts, the funeral, the trial, and then you get 4 interpretations from the period. There's no Jan Gross yet. That's post-89. 4 interpretations from the period. What did the church say? In fact, what did the Archbishop of Kielce say? He blamed the Jews, believe it or not. What did the communists say? They blamed the underground. What did the underground say? They blamed the communists. So and what did the independent voice say? So the idea that our visitors can actually confront multiple perspectives from the period, and we obviously have some commentary of our own, but we think that we withhold the post-89 debates. We know visitors know about them, but we withhold them from this moment of the story because those debates are for us a post-89 story. And we present other forms of violence, train violence, violence in other cities, with original documents. Layer 3, visitors can pull out these drawers and explore them. On the side that deals with those who stayed, which are more and more diminished in number, we explore Jewish life under communism. And we use the setting and the platform of the association, the Social and Cultural Association of Jews in Poland, the Test Kajet, the club, as our vehicle for doing that. But it's in March 1968 where I would say it's really a critical moment in the history of leaving, because that anti-Semitic campaign, at that moment, there are only about 23,000 Jews living in Poland, from the 240,000 that we had right after the war. And those ones that are still there in 1968 are the ones that didn't want to leave. And many of whom either never realized, the younger ones, never realized that they were Jewish, and never intended to leave, and were harassed, fired from their jobs, felt they had no option but to leave. So as a result of the March 68 campaign, which is a whole complicated story, I would say probably about, I don't know, maybe 13,000 left, and there were maybe 10,000 Jews left in Poland. 10,000. There were 3,300,000 Jews in Poland before the war. 90% of them were murdered, and of the 10% that survived, most survived in the Soviet Union, and of those who came back, most of them left. And so it's at this moment that basically the period after 68 is a feeling of absence. The story is over, that the book is closed, and the sense that there'll never ever be if you will, a Jewish world in Poland. But during, I would say, the late 70s and during the 80s, in the context of, if you will, the rise of the opposition, of solidarity, there are already signs and indications of the renewal of Jewish life. And after 1989, a very, very strong, on a small scale, renewal takes place. And so the final section of the post-war gallery is dedicated to what we call small numbers, big presence. That is to say, the absolute and relative number of Jews living in Poland is small, but Jewish presence in Polish consciousness is enormous. And it's that combination, I would say, that has made the creating of this museum possible. It's that combination. And so we end with the first time that we have video interviews is here, because they are in the present. They are with Jews living in Poland today. And we ask them a bunch of questions. But the best question is a question I could never imagine asking in Israel or here. And the question is, did you always know you were Jewish? It's a question that's very meaningful in the Polish context, very meaningful, and in other parts of Europe, in fact. And it's one of, who can make Jewish culture? What does Israel mean to you? Can you be a Jew alone? There's a whole series of questions, and more than 20 individuals, different ages, different walks of life, respond. And there's also a film that's an attempt to show, if you will, Jewish life in Jewish organizations and Jewish presence in Polish consciousness. Now, our plan is that as visitors exit from the Post-War Years Gallery, there's now a large circulation space that's quite empty. And our intention is to dedicate that space to what we call expanded geography. That is, to the story of Polish Jews who left Poland and who made their lives in other places, and who, if you will, what did they take with them, and what did they create in their new homes, and how are their lives today shaped by the history of Polish Jews. And so that will become, if you will, if the prologue was the forest, the epilogue is expanded geography. And our feeling is that this story is not complete if the perspective, particularly for the post-war years, is confined within the borders of Poland, that we have to expand the story out and to really actually address the story of something like 9 million Jews in the world, 70% of world Jewry today, who have their roots somewhere in this large, if you will, territory of what was the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. And so we are working hard to keep our story going, and March of the Living comes, the Israel groups come. Among our million visitors are many groups, and our task now, if you will, is to keep up the success, is how I would put it. So there you have it. Thanks.
Thank you very much. We are running low on time, but we have a few minutes to take some questions. And I think what we'll do in the interest of time is take a few questions from the floor, if there are any, and then I'll give Barbara the opportunity to answer any of those she pleases to answer, or to ignore them and answer other ones. So we'll take a couple questions, and we have 2 microphones, I think, that we'll pass around.
Who are the visitors who come to the museum? Are they from what nationality, from what ages, what Jewish, non-Jewish?
Okay, so, oh, sorry, go ahead.
Other questions?
Hi, how do you intend to keep the museum dynamic and get people visiting many times?
Other questions? Go ahead.
Okay, so on visitors, I would say that in the winter, which is not the tourist season, we get about, I would say 70% visitors are from Poland, 30% are from abroad, meaning other parts of Europe, Israel, North America, Australia. And of the visitors from abroad, about half are Jewish. And the other half are from everywhere. We have them from the Philippines, we have them Indonesia, believe it or not, Japan. So it's very international, and because it's on the list. If you're going to be in Poland, it's on the list of what you have to see. In fact, it was the first thing on the list, I think, in the New York Times recently of what to see and what to do in Poland. So in the summer, that is to say, in the season, let's say spring, summer, and early fall, it's about 50-50. So 50 from Poland, 50 international, and about half Jewish, half not. Age-wise, it's everybody. So when people ask me who is the museum for, who's our target audience, my answer is our target audience is the transformational generation. It means people from the adolescents and young adults. It means from 14 to 28, I mean, not so fixed, but yeah, basically adolescents, young adults, because we believe that they are the future, and that if we can reach them, that we think we can have huge impact. So that's our target audience, and we don't care whether they're Polish or Jewish or who they are. We have a Poland-Israel youth exchange. We have a Poland-Israel-Germany youth encounter. We have various ways of, I would say, trying to reach that generation, and we're very interested. We think that there's a huge message here for Jewish youth, as well as for Polish youth, German youth, and others. So that would be, I think, and it's all ages. So what that means is it's a site of informal learning, lifelong learning, and we've just opened a family education center for kids from the ages of 3 to 9. We have an education center, big education center that reaches school kids in primary and secondary school. These youth encounters are largely for university students. And then we're getting adults. We're getting families, we're getting adults all the way, people into their 90s. So it really, really, the nature of it is that you can take from it almost anything that you want, and you can visit it in a multitude of ways. With disability access, we have elevators for the upper levels within the exhibition, wheelchairs, we have special audio description for the visually impaired, we have a really I would say, an effort to reach, all sectors. And that basically. The second question is how to keep it dynamic and repeat visits. So I'll just answer that and we'll take another question. So first of all, we are an educational and cultural center. What that means is we have a very, very full program of films, lectures, conferences, symposia, workshops, and we have a Pauline Festival every year, which is a 3-day extravaganza. So there's a lot, people are coming because they know it's a place where things are happening. We also have commemorative events, so Yad Vashem medals are given in our auditorium. We have a 470-seat, state-of-the-art, beautiful auditorium. The Jewish Film Festival is held there. So there's a lot of things happening. But and we have a temporary exhibition program, we have a cafe, a resource center. But as far as the core exhibition is concerned, first of all, it's a living creature. A core exhibition is not, and there's no such thing as a permanent exhibition. Well, sometimes it feels that way. But in fact, it is a living organism. It's completed by the presence and the interaction and the responses of visitors. And there are opportunities always to make adjustments over time. Not immediately, but over time. But also, we've developed thematic tours for the core exhibition. Some of them are live, with live guides. Some of them are audio guides, which are multiple languages. And some of them are thematic guides in a printed form. So I just prepared one on the story of Yiddish as told in the core exhibition, for example, with 14 spots. There's another one, we call it 8 Highlights, 1 Hour. There's another one, I think we can even do one as 1 highlight, 10 minutes. For the visitor that is pressed for time. It would obviously be the synagogue, the elevator goes straight there. You can go, do it, get out. Maybe that's like what synagogues are like in some places. So the thematic tours. One of them is on women in the exhibition. I've had colleagues that are in women's studies, and I was really pleased when they said, we were really surprised. We think women are quite prominent in the exhibition. And we didn't set out to make a her story out of his story. We just told the story the way we thought it should be told. And we found great material, and women are very much present. So we did one thing, but specifically you could go through. Another is on Jewish religious life, because there's huge interest in something called Judaism, which I completely refuse to talk about in that way. That is, there's no normative Judaism in this exhibition. Judaism is not something eternal, normative, translocal. In this exhibition, our visitors on a need-to-know basis. Within about 2 meters into the exhibition, they learn about mikveh and about the Sabbath. But they learn about it from medieval sources that are like case law. So it's a very different approach. So as a result, there was huge demand. There's not enough about religion. There's not enough about Judaism. I said, okay, we'll make a thematic tour on Jewish religious life, starting with the medieval gallery and coming all the way up to the present, and to really try to communicate that you can't separate religion, particularly before the modern period, you cannot separate it from the rest of Jewish life. It's one piece. It's all one piece. So we did that one. So special, and then we did something very interesting. We have a music curator. So during our Pauline Festival, he developed a program called Hacking the Exhibition. So first I thought I was going to have a nervous breakdown because I had no idea. He said he's going to invite artists to take over the exhibition. I thought, oh God, I don't know what to expect. So what we determined is that they could take over some of the multimedia. Well, the things they did. So they took over, for example, we have a beautiful set of landscape paintings in the marketplace that really show you the great noble estates in the 18th century, beautiful watercolors from this Jean-Henry Muntz, this Alsatian painter. It's Poniatowski's estate. It's like fabulous. I give a look, and what do? It's Frank Stella and his Polish wooden synagogue painting series. I thought, oh my God. And Stella is talking, this Italian-American artist. There are his marvelous relief works from the Polish Village series. And then I turned the other direction to my beautiful wooden synagogue and the beautiful facade where we have a man going to the synagogue. And what do I see? They took my whole beautiful ceiling and made a kaleidoscope out of it. And there it was. And then I go to the Holocaust Gallery and I see there's a mob of people standing on the Aryan street looking up, and it was chilling. Because what we did is we created a kind of a bridge that was inspired by the bridge that joined two parts of the Warsaw Ghetto. So, and we have a double height gallery. And who was up there? It was a young man playing a violin solo. And it was, and they also had replaced some of our multimedia on these screens. Really, it was astonishing. So there are ways to intervene in the exhibition itself, even on a temporary, hopefully not permanent basis. There are special tours, special events. We have curatorial tours, expert tours. We have, sometimes it focuses on a single gallery, sometimes it's focused thematically. So I think there's a whole range of ways to, if you will, give visitors the opportunity to re-experience or experience the exhibition in new ways. And people are coming back and spending a lot of time in the exhibition anyway.
Barbara,
Yeah.
I think okay, we'll take one last question.
What happened to the folk art in the art of Polish Jews? And especially, haven't seen one ceremonial object where...
You just didn't notice, okay. Okay, so let me respond. So basically, the greatest expression of, if you will, Jewish vernacular or folk art is the synagogue. That's, I would say, in terms, if you want to really express a Jewish vernacular culture and folk art, I think the synagogue's it. But there are ritual objects. They're there in the home. There's a cabinet. It has, from the 18th century, candlesticks, a Hanukkah lamp. It has, I gave it to the museum, an 18th century illustrated Santa Verena women's Bible. It has a Kiddush cup. We have ceremonial art in the synagogue. We have Torah crown, a yad, a shas, a Torah breastplate. We have Purim, carved Purim wooden molds that we got from the Evo collection.
But what about the working together, also Polish and Jewish work?
That's the synagogue. That's the best expression of it. Okay, that's later.
Barbara, it's a privilege to hear you speak all the time. Thank you very much.
Oh, my pleasure.